Welcome to the Energy Policy Now podcast from the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Stone. On today's podcast, we'll take a look at the growing tension between the need to quickly ramp up renewable energy and the need to do so without sacrificing the very landscapes that we're trying to protect by shifting to clean power. Nationally, we'll need to dramatically expand renewable generation by mid-century to meet climate goals, in the process dedicating much more land to clean energy production. Where and how we build new clean energy resources matters deeply for ecosystems, farms, and the communities that depend on them. Bigger picture, where and how clean energy is sited directly influences the degree to which its climate benefits can be realized. On the podcast, we're joined by two experts in land use whose work seeks to address these tensions. Grace Wu is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has been an author on a series of recent reports on the impact of clean energy siting policies on the environment and on strategies to minimize those impacts while ensuring reliable and affordable clean energy. Jonathan Thompson is senior ecologist and research director at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts, a state where the push for solar power has meant real losses of forests and farmlands, and where the state is trying to rethink how and where clean energy gets built. Jonathan's work focuses on quantifying the impacts of land use on forest ecosystems and on policy remedies. The two will talk about the role of incentives and regulation in land use decision-making and how state and federal policies can lead to win-win outcomes. Grace and Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So let's start out for a moment just getting familiar with the work that each of you does. Grace, you're at UC Santa Barbara. Tell us about your research.
My work broadly is centered on climate action on land. Within that, I have two thrusts, the first of which is citing renewables and transmission infrastructure in ways that minimize impact to natural habitat. And the second is focused on how that infrastructure interacts with other forms of climate solutions, such as reforestation. So a lot of that requires spatial planning and land use planning.
And Jonathan, you're at Harvard Forest. What is the role of the forest and what does your work with it involve?
The Harvard Forest is a department within Harvard University, but separated by about 70 miles, where we have about 4,000 acres that we consider ourselves to be Harvard's outdoor laboratory and classroom. Within the portfolio research we do here, I am a landscape ecologist and think about how land use and land protection impacts both ecosystems and communities and work at this interface of human and natural systems.
So let's go into the conversation here. So Grace, starting at the national level, the U.S. needs to dramatically expand its renewable energy capacity to meet climate change or to address climate change. How much land is actually going to be needed to site this much new clean power? And what's at stake from a land and climate perspective if we don't plan carefully?
The net zero studies that I've seen for the US have put that capacity expansion requirement at something like 6 to 7 times the current capacity. And this is particularly for wind and solar, which make up the largest share of generation by mid-century. And in terms of land use, in total, in our studies, we find that up to 300,000 square miles, which is almost 200 million acres of land, would be required for a combination of onshore wind, solar PV, transmission, and bioenergy. And this is to meet net zero targets by 2050. We can reduce some of that land use, getting us to something closer to 200,000 square miles or 130 million acres. For those of you who don't know where to place those number of acres, to put that in perspective, that's essentially the land area equivalent of California for wind farms alone. which includes spacing requirements and the land area equivalent of Illinois in solar farms. And finally, the land area equivalent of Maryland in new transmission corridors. That's an enormous amount of land. And what's at stake in our intact landscapes, wildlife corridors, threatened endangered species habitat. We found those three categories are most at risk of land use conversion by these three technologies. And in terms of the social aspects, we also find that thousands of square miles of highly productive or prime farmland may be at risk.
So you've been an author on a series of reports that has been funded by the Nature Conservancy, and those are the Power of Place reports. That's the title of the reports. And the reports conclude that it is possible to meet climate goals with renewable energy while protecting natural and working lands. And you just mentioned that it sounded like about a third of the projected land use could be kind of rolled back with the correct land use planning in place. And the report does refer to a number of land-saving strategies, such as agrivoltaics, co-location, the use of fixed-tilt photovoltaics. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunities that these strategies present?
We found across multiple of the Power of Place studies that consistently, regardless of where you are in the U.S., prime farmland and farmland in general is a highly desirable type of land use for solar development, being flat, sunny, close to road infrastructure, close to transmission, and in some cases, substations. So those make it very desirable from a developer's perspective. And then in terms of other elements we were trying to address in our study were possible community opposition. So trying to ensure equitable distribution of benefits to increase the public acceptance of these types of large infrastructure projects. And then what I alluded to are in terms of environmental impact, we have typically referred to as greenfield solar projects that occur in forest, desert, shrubland, in some cases, even tall grass prairie.
Areas that have not been developed previously, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. Greenfield projects that, from our perspective, we would like to avoid. But the conflict here is we want to avoid greenfield projects, hence pushing a lot of that solar development on farmland. And so this environmental pressure and social opposition is really coming to a head and creating real land squeeze or conflict. And this is in addition to other pressure that's being put on the land for other climate solutions as well as adaptation. So this really compelled us in our last study to think creatively and kind of outside the box about other ways to represent and explore strategies to address some of these and actually to leverage some of the synergies that come with these technologies. So in the last study, we examined, as you said, three such land-sparing strategies: agrivoltaics, co-location, and fixed-tilt photovoltaics, all of which use land more efficiently. Agrivoltaics is the integration of solar panels into farmland in a way that does not displace food production. In our study, we were focused on crop-based systems, though agrivoltaics broadly encompasses rangelands, so grazing lands, as well as croplands.
And can you explain what agrivoltaics are a little bit for people who aren't familiar?
In the context of our study, we were really focused on the type of agrivoltaics that allows panels to be put above crops, in some cases row crops. And we did an extensive review of studies that reported shade tolerance of particular types of crops in response to either shade cloth or actual panels placed above them. So we find that several crops are actually very amenable to the type of shading that solar panels can provide. And not just amenable, but actually provide enhanced benefits, enhanced yields, or enhanced quality. So this is a type of synergy we were trying to exploit in the model by representing these types of systems. That's typically, very macro, very large scale, coarse. And so we characterized where these agrivoltaic systems could ideally be located in the US. We examined and reflected the cost increases of doing something like this. And we also represented the slight benefits for solar generation because of situating solar panels in a cooler environment, which actually increases the benefits for the electricity that can be generated per panel.
And the landowner would still earn from the crops as well as from the electricity production.
Yeah, so that's one of the benefits is that they can extract doubly from the land. And that also prevents this potential indirect land use change from displacing farmland with solar panels, is that farmland may cause cropland expansion elsewhere, potentially in natural habitat. So I think agrivoltaics addresses that potential harm from indirect land use change. And with the other two technologies, co-location, we define as the sharing of the same site by both wind and solar PV, has tremendous benefits that are very underexplored in the US, includes sharing road infrastructure, substation, transmission lines, the complementarity of the two types of technologies, meaning when wind blows is actually when solar is not available in many places of the US. So at night, wind speeds typically pick up, and then during the day, they die down, which is when solar comes online. And so we can actually utilize transmission lines much better. We don't have to have large corridors. It's a cost-saving strategy. Studies have shown that there's very little shading impacts from the turbines onto the panels themselves. And finally, we looked at fixed tilt PV, which is a type of technology that sounds like exactly what the term is it's panels that don't move, they're stagnant, compared to the currently prevailing technology, which is tracking a single axis tracking system, which tracks east-west as the sun moves along the horizon. It's actually about 30% less denser, so it saves 30% land, but it has lower capacity factors, meaning it's just less efficient at generating electricity.
You're talking about the fixed tilt or the tracking?
This is the fixed tilt. So it's more land use efficient, so it uses 30% less land compared to single axis tracking. It has lower capacity factor, so it just generates less electricity per hour in certain cases. But where it currently is the dominant technology, which is in the Northeast at higher latitudes, tracking systems, which are more expensive, don't actually add a lot more value due to these higher latitudes having just less direct sunlight, like direct radiation. And these fixed tilt panels are actually good and cheaper at harnessing that diffuse radiation. And so we wanted to capture this dynamic and calculate the cost as well as the land use savings from a fixed tilt versus a tracking system.
You have co-founded something that's called the Multi-Criteria Analysis for Planning Renewable Energy Initiative. Its goal is to identify the best renewable energy development areas. And you just kind of mentioned, putting things on co-location, et cetera. But what else are you focusing on in terms of, through that initiative, to really maximize both the energy potential of clean resources as well as minimize the land impacts?
In that initiative, we were trying to provide the spatial and land use planning tools to avoid development in the most highest impact and highest conservation value locations. And we wanted to do that at the same time as providing opportunities to site where the solutions are win-win, close to transmission, close to load centers, which are places that would use much of that electricity. The goal is to do this in a less piecemeal way, as opposed to looking at the landscape level to encourage zoning, so that we're not experiencing what some have termed energy sprawl.
This has spatial planning tools is one of the results. Who are those available to?
They're publicly available to anyone who has a capability and desire to use geospatial tools. We have worked with World Bank, the Electricity Sector Management Assistance Program, SMAP, to make a web version of that tool called RE Zoning. And the users of that are typically government employees, funders who are interested in finding bankable projects. And so we're hoping that this enables a wider swath of the population to be able to access spatial planning tools.
Let me ask you one more question here on this point. So your work focuses primarily on the West, not completely, but primarily on the West, as I understand. And in the West of this country, there are a lot of public lands, and that makes it very different from the East. How much of the development in the West is actually on these public lands and on private lands, just to get that perspective?
So most development of wind and solar have historically been on private land due to the ease of accessing that private land, the permitting hurdles, the cost. It's a confluence of multiple factors that have led to this outcome, even though there are multiple opportunities to site on public lands in the Western US. And so the opportunities to do that are within the hands of the Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM. And so I think that the emphasis has really been to encourage more public land development in a sensitive way, because a lot of that land is managed predominantly for biodiversity and to maintain intact habitat. But the incentives in the past have not yet been aligned to properly encourage enough developer interest. And that's from my understanding, primarily due to the cost differences of siting on public land and the time it takes to receive a permit. The BLM has attempted to address some of those issues, in addition to the concerns about siting on the most sensitive parts of the public lands through the Western Solar Plan, which was released last year. And they have designated kind of like the preferred sites for development, and I think are in the process of developing incentives, proper incentives, cost, transmission access to enable development in those areas.
Jonathan, I want to shift to you. We've been talking about a more national perspective. I want to talk specifically about Massachusetts, which is a state that has made real progress on solar, but that progress has come at a cost. Since 2010, the state has lost thousands of acres of forest and farmland due to solar power development. Can you introduce the major land use tensions that have emerged in Massachusetts?
Because Massachusetts has a legislatively mandated net zero goal for 2050, there is a lot of push to electrify the economy through green energy. And so there's been a big build out of solar. And so we've lost more than 13,000 acres in the past decade or so. And most of that has gone into and replaced forest land. Massachusetts is about 60% forested, and about 60% of the new ground mount solar has gone on former forest land. And you're right, that's resulted in a lot of land use tensions. I bet on my drive to work this morning, which is a 20-minute drive, I probably saw 20 different yard signs that either said, forest and solar, we need both, or say no to the Shutesbury solar project. And so it's really animated.
So it really is an issue that everybody's aware of and talking about, it sounds like.
It really is, and it's a shame, because it's divided the environmental community in between those who are primarily interested in land conservation versus those who are primarily interested in mitigating climate change. And as you noted in your setup, that there needs to be ways to do both. And so I think that was the greatest outcome of this report that I wrote in partnership with Massachusetts Audubon, which was to show that this is a false choice, that there are opportunities to meet the state's solar goals. 27 gigawatts is what they estimate they need by 2050, while retaining the forests that they need for both climate purposes and biodiversity and all the other great things that forests provide. We tried to map quite explicitly all the places that solar could go that wouldn't sacrifice the most valuable lands. More recently, the tension has expanded to some of the storage technologies. The small communities are understandably worried about big lithium ion batteries on top of their aquifers and what to do with a volunteer fire department and these facilities. So that's sort of been the latest front in these tensions, though that affects a much smaller amount of land. I'm excited to say that we seem to be moving past this either or, and at least the government is trying to work towards the both and perspective for forests and solar.
Well, as I understand, the issue also, as you've just started to talk about, is this ground mount solar development in Massachusetts. But the alternative to that, or one of the alternatives, would be to have all that solar mounted on rooftops.
Yeah, rooftops to start with. Also, we examined the potential for canopy solar, which is more expensive, yes, but comes with other benefits as well, as people can park their cars in the shade and outside of the weather. And so in many larger venues, like the University of Massachusetts has the